Bonjour, Kinamagi and Ireland Indigenous, and welcome to this Friday iCivics lesson. Today's lesson from iCivics, the electoral process. As you may have heard somewhere on TV or the radio, the internet, or pretty much everywhere else you might have heard from people, there's an election coming up. So I wanted to review the electoral process with you today, and then we'll have some questions about it at the end. So I'll begin by reading this document to you. If you so choose, you could read the pages that you need to independently and then answer the questions, or you can listen because sometimes I do add in some extra information. For those of you who stayed with, it's election time. Every 4 years, our country holds a presidential election. The candidates debate, hit the road, talking to voters, and put advertisements on television, radio, and the internet. All this hard work actually starts months or even years before Election Day in November. So, what does it take to go from a hopeful candidate to a victorious president? The first public step a candidate has to take is to declare to the nation that he or she wants to be president. Then candidates must get support for their campaign, raise money, and get the attention of the leaders of his or her political party. So a lot of this part will take place, if this is 2020, this was going on in 2017, 2018, and for some candidates late into 2019. I know President Trump pretty much announced his intent to seek re-election almost immediately after being inaugurated in 2017. So presidential campaigns are very long, and they're now going from what used to be 1 to 2 years to 2 to 3 years and almost 4. Narrowing the field. Candidates for the larger political parties are chosen at party meetings called conventions. The parties hold conventions at the local, state, and national levels. There are two main ways the states send people to the national convention: the caucus and the primary. Both methods result in a set of delegates who will attend the national conventions. The delegates pledge that when they attend the convention, they will vote for the candidate the state political party supports. So you can see a little bit of a Venn diagram here, the caucus system. And when we think caucuses, I personally think Iowa, that's the first in the nation. And you literally have a chance to put a bunch of people in the room, and you go to your corner and you go to others. And if you're not sure, they try to persuade other people, like, come join our side. Here's why you should vote for our candidate. So it's really a giant discussion. And then eventually they reach a consensus. Primaries is what we hold here in Michigan. New Hampshire historically holds one of the first ones, and that was in early February. That's where we vote, and you vote for the candidate. It's very similar to voting in the general election, except that it's run by the parties, and you can't vote for a Republican and then a Democrat and then a Libertarian or a Green. It has to be all of one party. So we go through this whole system, and we have events called like Super Tuesday. Michigan's primary wasn't until second week of March, just before the pandemics. Literally, the first cases in Michigan came after. So that kind of gives you that time frame. And then after a while, we start to find who's leading. Candidates will be coming in and dropping out. Some candidates never even make it this far, and they're like, yeah, we don't really have a chance. All right, and the nominee is. Each party holds its national conventions in huge arenas with balloons, confetti, funny-looking hats, and lots of media coverage. That is, unless it's 2020 and you're in the middle of a pandemic. So for this part, it is extremely different. We did Zooms and made for TV programming. Not that these conventions aren't made for TV programming, but this was the only way now. So delegates chosen from each state discuss it and debate the candidates, listen to speeches, and help create the party platform. Near the end of the multi-day convention, the delegates cast their votes for the party's nominee who will run in the national election. That was, again, this time around, you got to see this process with each state and territory, but they were done remotely. And we'll see what happens in 2024 if it stays a little more remote or if it goes back to these huge events. That I couldn't tell you. The presidential and vice presidential nominees each make an acceptance speech that is meant to bring the party together to support the nominees and forget about the months of debate and arguments that led up to their nomination. This is the first major step in getting the national campaign for president up and running. And if you watch the convention, you would have seen both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump's acceptance speeches. All right, so now we got to go out on the campaign trail. Millions of dollars are spent in the months leading up to the national conventions, but that's the beginning. Once the field is narrowed to the two main party candidates, fundraising becomes even more important. There are only a few months before the general election, and each candidate needs to get his or her message out to the American public. The parties in each state help the candidates with paying the bills and organizing support. A political campaign is the process of gathering public support for a candidate. The goal of a campaign is to deliver as much information about the candidate and the party's platform to as many people as possible. Candidates campaign in a variety of ways. Direct mail, like my mailbox is full of things from people. I've literally received 14 things in like the last 3 weeks from one of the candidates for a local election where I live. You'll see the ads all over the internet. You'll be printed material like bumper stickers. Bumper stickers are still a thing. You've probably seen quite a few around. Personal appearances, a lot of trips to the radio and TV interviews, especially TV interviews, because those translate over to internet clips very easily. And this all brings us to Election Day. The main election day for the United States is in November, although there are other election days throughout the year. People across the nation go to the polls and select which candidate they want for the next president. As polls close from state to state, the news media reports who is getting the most votes. The next morning, the media announces a winner of the popular vote, which is a tally of the votes cast, but that is just one step in the process. This will not be a thing this year. With a pandemic going on, lots of people are choosing to vote by mail. And with that, it takes a lot more time to count the votes. So it's extremely unlikely that we will go to bed on election day knowing who had won, like we have in past years. It was considered an outlier back in the 50s when we knew it took till the next morning to know who won. This is going to be different. This might take weeks. We'll see. So once we've got all of that out of the way, then we get to the part that actually selects the president, the Electoral College. The U.S. Constitution requires an extra step in the process of electing the president. This step is called the Electoral College. Each state has a group of people called electors who cast the actual votes for president. When you vote for a presidential candidate, you're really voting to decide which candidate the electors in your state will vote for. This is true in Michigan, but it's not true in every state. Some states allow for what's called a faithless elector. And if you look closely at 2016's returns, there were several people who received electoral votes that may or may not have been an expectation of the voters. In December after the election, the electors meet in their state capitals and cast their ballots. Even though you cast one vote for a president, vice president team, electors cast 2 votes, one for each office. After the electors vote, President of the Senate collects the votes and counts them. President of the Senate would be the current vice president. There are 538 electors, and in order to win, the presidential and vice presidential candidates must have an absolute majority of votes, means more than half, at least 270. Then on January 20th, the president-elect and vice president-elect take the oath of office and are inaugurated. So if we get to 269, it's going to tell you in the next paragraph. If there is a tie or no candidate gets 270 votes, in that case, the House of Representatives votes to decide which candidate will become president. They haven't done that by the time inauguration day rolls around, then the vice president-elect acts as president. The Senate decides who that will be by voting to choose one of the vice presidential candidates. If that's a tie too, then the current Speaker of the House becomes president. That's never happened, but the elections of 1800 and 1824 both had to be resolved by Congress. And you'll go through and there's documents that I may or may not share with you as far as the homework. A little rundown of the Bush Gore campaign in 2000. It was a giant mess. Um, Gore received more votes nationally, and it came down to who won Florida. And it was extremely close. The ballots were difficult to understand, which gave us the phrase the hanging chads. And it ended up going down to the Supreme Court, which still barely voted to decide who would become president. And that turned out to be George W. Bush, um, which is why you don't hear of President Al Gore. We have reached the end of the reading. Um, I would like you to return to the Google Classroom and fill out the Google form. Gijigad, Mama P.